In the spring of 1943, the Pacific Ocean stretched wide and endless under a sky that burned with light. Across its vast horizon, the Empire of Japan ruled with an iron shadow. Its ships cut through the blue expanse like blades. Its planes filled the air with the rising sun's red mark. For 2 long years, the Pacific had belonged to them. The Mitsubishi Zero, sleek, light, and untouchable, had become the terror of the skies. It turned tighter, climbed faster, and struck harder than any plane the Allies could send against it. Its pilots were young, disciplined, and fearless, men who had grown up believing that death in the Emperor's name was the highest honor. Their enemies called them ghosts. Their own people called them gods of the sky. To the Americans who fought over the jungles of the Solomons and the waters of the Coral Sea, the Zero seemed invincible. Each encounter ended the same way. Smoke trailing into the ocean, a single parachute blooming too late, a call over the radio fading into static. The war in the air was not just about steel and fire. It was about fear, and the Japanese had mastered it. At the center of this empire stood one man, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. He was more than a commander. He was the mind behind the strike on Pearl Harbor, the man who had planned it down to the last wave. His strategy had thrown the world into war. His name carried the weight of victory and vengeance alike. To the Japanese people, he was a hero. To the Americans, he was the ghost that would not rest. But even legends are bound by time. By early 1943, cracks had begun to appear in Japan's perfect war machine. Its navy bled oil with every voyage. Its pilots were dying faster than new ones could be. Trained. The empire stretched across thousands of miles of ocean, but its reach was weakening. And in Washington and Hawaii, the men of the United States Navy knew it. They had seen the tide start to shift, slowly, quietly, inevitably. In a secret facility buried deep within the Pacific Command, a handful of codebreakers worked night and day, their eyes fixed on the steady rhythm of intercepted Japanese messages. They had already cracked the enemy's naval cipher once before, the code that had led them to victory at Midway. Now, in the spring of '43, they were listening again. Every signal mattered. Every pattern meant something. And then, one message came through that changed everything. It was routine at first glance, an itinerary, a report of inspection flights, a list of times and locations, but one name stood out: Yamamoto. The architect of Pearl Harbor was planning to visit the front lines, flying from Rabaul to Bougainville to meet with his pilots and boost morale. The message was detailed. Too detailed. It included his departure time, his route, and the number of planes in his escort. It was the kind of information no one outside Japan's highest command should ever have known. The Americans knew what they were holding. If they acted, they could end the life of the man who had humiliated them at Pearl Harbor. But there was a danger. If the Japanese realized their code had been broken, they would change it immediately. Erasing months of painstaking work, the decision went up the chain of command. Admiral Chester Nimitz read the message in silence. His officers waited. The room was still. To strike would mean revealing their secret. To stay silent would mean letting Yamamoto live. The admiral took off his glasses and whispered the words that sealed history. Do it. The plan was simple and almost impossible. Yamamoto's flight would take place deep inside enemy territory, hundreds of miles from any Allied base. No ordinary fighter could reach him. Engage and return. Even the fastest American planes of the time lacked the range to make such a journey. There was only one aircraft capable of it, a twin-engine interceptor, built for speed and endurance. A machine unlike anything else in the sky. It had already proven itself in Europe and the Pacific. Its long silver wings and twin booms gave it a look that pilots called the fork-tailed devil, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. It was fast. It was agile. And most importantly, it could fly farther than any fighter in the world. This would be its defining moment, a mission of vengeance, precision, and silence. The order went out under total secrecy. Only a handful of men would know. 18 pilots were selected from the 339th Fighter Squadron, all veterans, all calm under fire. They were briefed in a locked room, away from radios, maps, or notebooks. Their commander spoke the target's name only once, Yamamoto. No one needed to ask. Why? They all knew what it meant. They were to hunt the man who had once brought war to their homeland, and they would do it in the sky he believed he owned. As the sun rose on the morning of April 18th, 1943, the mission began. Engines growled across Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, their propellers slicing through the dawn. 18 P-38 Lightning stood ready. Their tanks were full to the brim with fuel, their guns loaded, their pilots silent. Each man checked his controls, glanced at the horizon and thought the same thought. This flight might not bring him back. They were flying over 500 miles into enemy skies, guided by nothing but math, radio silence, and faith. The odds were near impossible, but so was the moment. As the first aircraft lifted off the runway, the ground crew watched in silence. The Lightnings rose one by one, their silver wings catching the sunlight. They turned east, toward the sea, toward history. And as they climbed into the clouds, the island behind them grew small, the ocean below infinite. The mission to kill Yamamoto had begun. They chose their pilots not by bravado but by steadiness. Veterans were preferred, men who had flown, through flak and come home, men who did not shout at the sky but listened to it. The commander picked them quietly. No parades, no speeches, only a map, a target, and one word: Yamamoto. The plane chosen for this silent hunt was unlike the single-engine fighters men knew. It carried twin engines, twin booms, and a central nacelle where the pilot sat alone with his thoughts. Pilots called it many things: the fork-tailed devil, the lightning. But when the mission was spoken of in hushed tones, they named the reason plainly. It had range, it had speed, it had the chance to bring a man back alive who had flown too many times into their nightmares. Technically, the P-38 Lightning was a study in contradictions that worked. Twin. Allison engines meant redundancy, and endurance turbochargers let it fight at altitudes where many other fighters choked. Its concentrated forward armament, guns mounted in the nose, rather than spread across the wings, delivered a single, devastating burst that did not need to be aimed with wing alignment. It was an airplane that favored aim and reach over graceful turns. Mechanics filled the tanks with extra fuel. Spares were strapped into bays. Every seam was checked twice. The Lightnings would fly nearly 1,000 miles out and then come back. There would be no field to land on if one failed. The sea would be waiting with cold hands. Pilots sat through briefings that were more geometry than rhetoric. They learned angles, timing, and the math of interception. The navigator worked with charts that were as delicate as lace. All the numbers were written in words to avoid any mistake. The hours were spelled out. The bearings drawn slowly on paper. The altitude given in round. Careful phrases. Radio silence would be absolute. No chatter. Every transmission could betray them. They flew by stars, by drift, and by the careful watch of men who had learned to read the ocean like a book. The plan itself was audacious in its simplicity. Fly out under the cover of dawn. Approach the enemy route from an unexpected vector, use altitude surprise, and the Lightning's closing speed to strike the target and vanish before escort fighters could react. Each pilot was assigned a wingman. Pairs would protect each other on the long transit. And in the moment of attack, they practiced formation flying until their muscles remembered the pattern without thought. They practiced emergency procedures until they could perform them with their eyes closed. On the morning chosen, clouds lay low in ragged curtains. Dawn came pale and hesitant. Mechanics pushed the Lightnings to the line, checked the oil, closed the canopies, and stepped back. The weight of the task hung in the air like a metal scent. Not one man smiled. Not one joked. The Lightnings rolled forward. Their engines thundered. A two-heartbeat rhythm that matched the pilot's pulses. One by one they leapt into the gray. At first, the island looked like a dotted toy below. Then the sea took them in. The first hours were hunger and boredom disguised as motion. Cruise speed. Trim engine checks. The long coastlines of maps passed beneath like written letters in a book no one had permission to read aloud. Pilots slept in fits, waked to sip syrupy coffee, checked gauges, and slipped back into a thin, practiced quiet. They avoided known patrol lanes, curved around reefs and atolls, and climbed to altitudes where the air thinned and even clouds seemed respectful. The navigator measured wind drift with tools so old they looked ceremonious. Everything was paced to a single, impossibly precise schedule. As the Lightnings pushed deeper into enemy space, the men became small against the sky. No radio call could reach them if they were discovered. They were vulnerable and thus depended on craft and calculation alone. On the charts, the escort profile read like a challenge. 2 medium bombers would carry Yamamoto. They would be flanked by 0 fighters. The old masters of turning fights. But the Americans knew something else. The escort might be seasoned, but it would not expect an intercept so far from any base. They arranged their timing like a watchmaker. The attack had to occur at a point where the Lightnings could dive with speed and then climb again to escape. It had to be a moment measurable to seconds. Pilots rehearsed the sequence. In their heads, climb, cut power, dive, deliver fire, brake hard, and run. The moment before contact is a thin thing. It is not quite calm. It is not yet chaos. It is a listening. As they drew near the expected corridor, eyes scanned the sky with a kind of hunger. A radio whisper from a picket boat had given them confirmation. The watchful men ashore relayed a sighting. Now everything narrowed to a single strip of horizon. Then, far ahead, the shadows grew into shapes. Transport wings, a formation, moving with the spare dignity of purpose. For a heartbeat, the pilots saw the enemy as they had once seen. Friends in a different light, small men inside small machines, each one human and mortal. Then orders collapsed into motion. The Lightnings peeled into position, their noses steeled, their guns warmed, altitude, angle, and closing speed set the geometry of the strike. There was no bravado, only the cold arithmetic of survival. When they engaged, it would be brief and punished. Wrong choice and the ocean would claim them. But every man knew why he had come. They were not hunting glory. They were hunting an idea made human. The man who had given their nation a wound and would now be punished by its answer. Clouds swallowed the first aircraft as it dove toward the enemy. Corridor. Silence thrummed in the cockpit. Hands moved the controls with the calm of trained repetition. Each pilot trusted the Lightning not as a talisman, but as a tool, precise, brutal, and true. They came in sight as shadows first, small and delicate against the vast blue. 2 Japanese transport planes, their silver skins flashing in sunlight, trailed by a handful of 0 escorts. The formation moved. Steady and proud, unaware of the invisible line drawn across the sky. The lead. Lightning dived first, engines screamed as gravity took hold. The others followed, silent and disciplined, falling from 20,000 feet like arrows released by an unseen hand. Every second mattered now. Through his canopy, Major Thomas Lanphier saw them, white glints in the distance, faint, fragile, alive. His mind split the moment into pieces. Distance, speed, angle, sun. He steadied the controls. The twin Allison engines howled. Below, the Pacific flashed like glass. He aimed not at a plane, but at a future written long ago, a future that had begun at Pearl Harbor. The range closed fast. 2,000 yards, 1,000! He squeezed the trigger. The nose guns roared as the Lightning shook under the recoil. Tracers tore through the sky like molten rain. 1 transport shuddered, smoke spilling from its right engine. Its escort tried to turn, but it was too late. The Lightnings were already inside the formation, slicing it apart. Captain Rex Barber lined up on the second transport. His focus narrowed until the entire war became a single point of aim. He fired. Short, sharp bursts. Bullets ripped through metal and flame burst from the wing. The Japanese bomber began to fall, trailing black smoke that twisted into the wind like a dying banner. Inside that falling plane sat Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. For a few seconds more, he looked out at the sky he had once ruled. No words were recorded. No final command, only the soft hum of a burning engine, the sound of gravity claiming its due. The plane rolled once, caught fire, and vanished into the jungle below. The escorting Zeros finally reacted, diving hard to protect what could no longer be saved. The sky turned into a whirlpool of tracers and contrails. One Lightning spiraled down, hit in the wing. Another dove through the chaos and climbed again, its pilot gritting his teeth, refusing to yield. In minutes, it was over. When the Lightnings broke away, the formation was gone. Behind them, two black plumes rose from the jungle. No radio call was made. No cheers echoed. Only silence filled the headsets as the pilots turned home. The flight back was long, cruel, and quiet. Engines coughed as fuel ran low. Compass needles trembled. Every man flew by instinct now, trusting the math written hours ago in the dim light of a tent. Clouds built over the sea, rain streaked the glass. Still, they flew. Hours later, Henderson Field came into view, a thin green line between ocean and storm. One by one, the P-38s descended, wheels hitting the ground with weary grace, engines cut, canopies opened, and the men sat still for a moment. Unable to speak, they had flown into the heart of the enemy's sky. And returned. Mechanics ran to the planes, counting bullet holes, checking for blood. No one asked what had happened. The pilots simply climbed down and nodded to their crew chiefs. Then Lanphier, his face streaked with sweat and oil, said what everyone already knew. We got him. The word spread through the base like a spark. No announcement, no celebration, just a quiet, stunned relief. The man who had planned Pearl Harbor was gone. The score was not balanced. Nothing could balance it, but it was answered. Thousands of miles away, the Japanese Navy waited for a message that would never come. When the wreckage was found 2 days later, Yamamoto's body was recovered, still strapped in his seat, his white gloves unburned, his sword at his side. The Empire mourned in silence. Radio Tokyo called it a heroic death. But deep down, the officers who read the coded orders understood what it meant. The Americans had known. Their code had been broken. From that moment on, Japan changed its communications entirely. But the loss of Yamamoto was more than logistical. It was spiritual. The architect of Japan's daring had fallen to his own design, and the P-38 Lightning had become more than an airplane. It was a symbol of reach, of retribution, of inevitability. As the sun set over the Pacific that night, the pilots of the 339th stood by their planes in silence. They looked out toward the horizon where sky met sea and thought of what they had done. They had not fought a battle that would be written in the grand history of fleets. They had fought one that ended a man, and in that ending, the war itself had shifted. The next day, when the official message was sent to Washington, it contained only 5 words, Yamamoto confirmed. Mission complete. And somewhere in the vast quiet of the ocean below, the jungle kept its secret, the broken remains of a warlord and the echo of engines that had come for him. News of the mission was buried beneath layers of secrecy. For days, only a handful of men knew the truth. The official reports listed the interception as a routine patrol. The press release spoke only of enemy aircraft downed over the Solomon Islands, but inside the upper circles of command, the message traveled like fire. The architect of Pearl Harbor was dead. When Washington confirmed it, the president did not smile. Franklin Roosevelt had wanted justice, not celebration. The war was far from over. But he understood what it meant. For the first time, Japan had lost more than ships and planes. It had lost the man who had given it direction. Within the Imperial Navy, the news arrived like a thunderclap. Officers bowed their heads in disbelief. Pilots stared at the ground, unable to speak. For years they had followed Yamamoto as a living symbol of destiny. Now destiny itself had vanished into smoke. The funeral was conducted with strict ceremony. His body was returned to Tokyo, escorted by aircraft draped in the rising sun flag. Crowds lined the streets as the procession passed, their silence deeper than grief. The government declared him a martyr. But those who understood strategy knew better. They knew that without Yamamoto, Japan's war would lose its rhythm. He had been the one who warned them of this. Before Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto had written to his superiors, pleading that war with America could not be won. "I shall run wild for 6 months," he had said, "but after that I have no expectation of success." He had been right, and now, as the war dragged into its 3rd year, his prophecy hung over every officer's desk like a ghost. Meanwhile, on Guadalcanal, the men of the 339th Fighter Squadron resumed their routines. They did not boast of what they had done. They repaired their planes, checked their guns, and flew new missions. But when they passed each other on the tarmac, there was a quiet look exchanged, a look that said they had touched history. The P-38 Lightning became a legend overnight. Every pilot wanted to fly one. Its twin booms and sleek silhouette were unlike anything else in the air. It could climb like a demon, dive like a stone, and still glide home on a single engine. Its power made it the hunter of the Pacific. Lockheed engineers back in California received word of the mission's success. They gathered in silence in the Burbank factory, surrounded by half-built fuselages and the metallic scent of oil. For them, it was proof that design could decide destiny. The aircraft they had built not only reached farther than any fighter before, it had changed the shape of the war. Pilots began to speak of the Lightning with reverence. They said it carried them, not the other way around. Some believed the plane had a will of its own, that it wanted to come home. Mechanics treated it like a living thing, tapping its skin before flight, whispering small rituals of luck. But not every mission carried victory. The Pacific skies were wide and merciless. For every man who returned, another vanished into the blue. There were no graves in the sea, only coordinates whispered once and never again. Yet even in loss, the Lightning endured. It gave its pilots a chance, and that chance meant survival. By late 1943, the Allies had gained something new: confidence. They had proven they could strike anywhere, reach anyone. Morale soared. In Tokyo, paranoia spread. If the Americans could kill Yamamoto, they could reach the Emperor next, or so the whispers went. The myth of invincibility was cracking. The mission to kill. Yamamoto had done more than avenge Pearl Harbor. It had taught both sides a truth neither wanted to. Technology and intelligence, not tradition, would decide the future. The sword had given way to the circuit, the will of a single man replaced by the calculation of 1,000 minds. From then on, the war became colder, sharper, and more precise. Every mission was plotted with maps and mathematics. Every target was chosen with data, not passion. The age of heroic instinct was ending. The age of intelligence had begun. The P-38 Lightning, once just another fighter, became the embodiment of that change. Its silhouette appeared in propaganda posters, in newsreels, in the dreams of every young pilot. To the Japanese, it was a nightmare that came without warning. To the Americans, it was the angel of vengeance, quiet, efficient, unstoppable. But those who flew it knew another truth. It was not invincible. It was temperamental, heavy, and demanded skill. A careless hand could send it into a spin that no amount of prayer could recover. It rewarded precision and punished pride. And in that, it mirrored the new war it helped to create. A war where survival belonged not to the brave, but to the careful. As 1944 approached, new machines began to take the stage. Faster, deadlier, more advanced, but none would ever carry the same shadow, because the Lightning had done something no other aircraft had ever done before. It had hunted a legend, and won. After Yamamoto's death, the Pacific War entered a new rhythm, colder, more mechanical, but no less brutal. The Allies were no longer simply reacting. They were shaping the sky, rewriting its rules. Factories in America pulsed with tireless energy. Steel was melted, cast and reborn as wings. The sounds of riveting guns echoed like distant thunder, building a storm that would soon cross the ocean. The P-38. Lightning stood at the center of it all, a living example of how design could bend the course of war. Lockheed engineers refined every inch of it. They learned from each mission, each loss, each returning plane scarred by fire and victory. They replaced bolts, reshaped wings, upgraded engines, and stripped away weakness. The Lightning that returned in 1944 was not the same machine that had left Burbank 2 years earlier. It was leaner, faster and smarter. Pilots now trusted it as an extension of themselves. They flew it across the jungles of New Guinea, over the coral seas of the Philippines, and into the volcanic skies of Iwo Jima. It carried cameras for reconnaissance, rockets for ground attack, and the weight of thousands of missions that depended on precision. It was the first American aircraft to see combat in both Europe and the Pacific, a bridge of steel connecting two wars. In the Pacific, its long range turned islands into stepping stones. Squadrons could escort bombers deep into enemy space, harass supply routes, and strike at airfields thought untouchable. Japanese commanders soon realized that distance, once their shield, had become a trap. No base was too far now. The Lightning could find them all. American pilots began to score victories that rewrote the balance of the air war. Major Richard Bong, flying a P-38, became the top-scoring American ace of the entire conflict. His kills were not just numbers. They were proof of control. Each engagement told the same story: speed, surprise, and power winning over agility and tradition. The Japanese, who had once ruled the sky with elegance, now found themselves cornered by brute endurance. Their Zero fighters still turned tightly, still danced through dogfights with grace, but their thin armor and limited fuel could not survive the Lightning's relentless reach. It was a clash between philosophy and physics, one built on honor, the other on evolution. Behind this technological rise was another invisible weapon: information. American codebreakers continued their quiet war. They read enemy transmissions, tracked fuel convoys, and predicted attacks before they happened. Each intercepted message was another invisible victory. The mission that had brought down Yamamoto had proven how deadly intelligence could be. Now it was doctrine. The P-38 was often the first to act on that. Intelligence. When a secret supply convoy was discovered, Lightnings would appear like ghosts from the horizon, strafing ships before they could radio for help. When an airfield was located, they struck with precision, destroying rows of parked aircraft before pilots could climb aboard. Even Japanese civilians began to speak of them in fearful tones, the silver fork-tailed demons that appeared from nowhere. But for the men inside the cockpit, the war never became easy. Each mission meant hours of endurance, eyes burning from glare, muscles stiff from vibration, minds trapped in the endless hum of engines. The Pacific could be cruel. A single storm could swallow a flight whole. Navigation errors meant vanishing into the sea. No trace, no echo, many never returned. And yet, those who did return found themselves part of something larger. They were no longer just pilots. They were instruments of a machine far greater than themselves, an industrial, mathematical empire of war that stretched from factory floors to airfields to the open sky. They began to notice the difference between their world and the one they fought, the Japanese War. Machine was elegant but brittle. Its strength lay in spirit. The American one was relentless, a tide of production and adaptation that could not be broken. The Lightning symbolized that difference perfectly. Where the Zero lived and died by the skill of one pilot, the P-38 lived by the strength of many. In this new war, courage was not enough. You needed systems. You needed structure. You needed to learn faster than you could bleed. By late 1944, the sky over the Pacific was no longer Japanese. Every island captured meant another airfield. Every mission flown meant one less place for the enemy to hide. The Lightning led those advances, its silver wings cutting through clouds like prophecy. When bombers struck the Japanese home islands, Lightnings often guided them there, scouting, mapping, and clearing the path. What had begun as a single act of vengeance, a mission to end one man, had become a strategy to end an empire. And in that transformation, the P-38 Lightning had done something few machines ever do. It had changed not just a battle, but the very nature of war itself. The skies over the Pacific grew louder with each passing month. Engines roared from dawn until dusk, filling the air with the rhythm of progress and destruction. American. Airfields stretched across islands that had once been names on maps. Now they were launch pads for the final act of the war. By 1944, the Lightning was no longer alone. New fighters had joined the ranks: the P-47 Thunderbolt, the P-51 Mustang, the Hellcat, and the Corsair. But none carried the myth that the Lightning did. It had been the spear that first reached across the Pacific, the blade that cut through distance and found its target in the dark. Its shadow lingered, even as newer planes took its place. In the air, the Lightning had become a symbol of precision. Pilots could fly higher than the Zero, stay longer in combat, and dive faster without fear of breaking apart. They had learned to fight not by instinct alone, but by measurement, altitude, range, and energy. Each battle became a calculation. And in that cold arithmetic, the Americans were winning. The Japanese pilots still fought with courage. They flew until fuel ran dry, until guns overheated, until sky and sea blurred into one endless void. But their machines were failing them. Resources were scarce. Factories bombed engines, built from weaker metals, burned out faster. Each month, the difference grew. In Tokyo, the high command faced a truth they could no longer deny. They had built an empire on daring, but they were fighting an enemy that built one on endurance. Every Lightning that took off from a Pacific island was another reminder that technology had replaced spirit as the deciding force of war. For American pilots, the change was personal. The early years of fear and desperation had given way to control. They were no longer running from Zeros. They were hunting them. When a Japanese squadron appeared, the Lightnings rose to meet them like wolves to prey. The air filled with the roar of engines, the rattle of guns, and then silence. Dogfights that once lasted minutes now ended in seconds. The Lightnings' concentrated firepower shredded enemy aircraft before they could complete a turn. Its turbo-charged engines gave it speed at altitudes the Zero could not reach. And when the enemy tried to escape into clouds or sunlight, radar and coordination brought them back into crosshairs. But for all its power, the Lightning never became invulnerable. The Pacific had a way of humbling men and machines alike. Engines overheated in the tropical heat. Fuel lines froze at high altitude. One mistake could still end a mission in fire or water. Pilots learned to respect the airplane not as a friend, but as a creature that demanded discipline. Those who survived began to develop rituals. They touched the fuselage before flight. They spoke to the plane in whispers. They checked the guns by sound, not by sight. Each gesture was a prayer to technology, a strange mix of faith and science. On the ground, engineers kept perfecting the design. They introduced dive brakes to control high-speed descents. They improved the pressurization systems, reinforced the armor, and equipped the later models with rockets and bombs. The Lightning had become not just a fighter, but a platform, a foundation for new ideas in aviation. And in its reflection, the war itself was changing. The focus shifted from individual duels to coordinated assaults. Fighter groups operated as living machines, each part synchronized with radar stations. Codebreakers and command ships, information, flowed faster than bullets. Every pilot was now a node in an invisible network, was no longer about the courage of one man against another. It was about how many systems could think together in the same instant. And in that new world, the Lightning fit perfectly. Its twin engines mirrored the dual nature of the war itself, power and precision, destruction and survival. By the end of 1944, the Lightning's legend was complete. It had carried messages, cameras, rockets, and vengeance. It had fought in every major campaign, escorted bombers through typhoons, and landed on strips barely wide enough for its wings. It had become both sword and shield, a machine that defined an era. But even legends fade. The age of the jet was approaching. New engines promised speeds no propeller could match. Designers whispered of aircraft that would climb faster than sound, planes that would make the Lightning seem old before its time. And yet, none of them would ever carry its story. The story of the moment when technology learned to think in the language of distance, silence, and inevitability. As the war neared its end, the Lightning remained at the front, its silver body streaked with oil and victory. It had begun as a weapon built for one mission. It had become the machine that taught humanity what the future of war would look like. The new year brought with it both triumph and exhaustion. The Pacific was vast, but the empire that once ruled it was now shrinking, piece by piece. Island by island, each battle brought the Americans closer to Japan's heart, and wherever the carriers went, the Lightning's long shadow followed. The missions grew longer, the targets grew harder. Now the Lightnings were not just interceptors, they were pathfinders, escorts and eyes for the bombers that would soon darken Japan's skies. They photographed every bay, every airfield, every coastal gun. Their cameras revealed the shape of a nation preparing for its final defense. By 1945, the Japanese air arm was fighting on memory alone. Their veterans were gone, their students untrained, their factories burned. Planes rolled off assembly lines with uneven wings, engines failing before their first flight, and yet they flew. Because in Japan, to die in the air was still an honor. The Lightnings met them without hate. They fought with efficiency, not fury. A duel that had once been emotional now felt mechanical, a process, an equation. Where there had once been fear, there was now only rhythm. A calm, clinical rhythm of pursuit, fire, and silence. From the ground, soldiers watched the contrails cross above like white scars. They could tell who was winning by which line disappeared first. To them, the Lightning was a ghost, a machine that came and went faster than they could point. Each pilot carried his own ghosts. 2. The early victories no longer brought joy. They were just markers on a map of exhaustion. Men began to count not kills but missions survived. The ones who had been there from the start looked older than their years, their eyes dulled by repetition. One pilot wrote in his logbook, "We no longer fly for glory. We fly to end it." And that was the truth of it. The war had consumed everything, energy, youth, purpose, and now the only goal left was silence. In April of 1945, Lightnings escorted bomber streams toward the home islands. They crossed the threshold of fear that had once protected Japan. Cities burned below like embers scattered across an ocean of darkness. The Lightnings. Cameras recorded it all. The destruction, the surrender, the final unraveling of a nation built on dreams of the sky. In those final months, the P-38 served a new purpose. No longer the hunter. It became the guide. Its long wings carried messages. Its cameras brought knowledge. Its presence promised the end. It had outlived the man it was built to destroy. It had outlasted the war that gave it birth. When the Emperor's surrender was announced in August, the Lightning still circled the Pacific. They flew patrols over seas now calm and empty, over islands where smoke rose from the ruins of airfields. Their engines echoed off silent hangars, and their pilots looked down at the world they had remade. Some felt triumph, most felt relief. A few felt nothing at all, because they understood something deeper. The Lightning had not just defeated an enemy, It had helped end an age. The age where courage alone could change the outcome of a war was gone. Now, only machines and minds could do that together. As peace returned, the lightnings began to fade from the sky. They were flown home, one by one. Across the ocean they had once conquered. Some were scrapped, some were stored in hangars. A few were kept for training, teaching a new generation how speed and calculation had replaced instinct and valor. But the men who had flown them remembered every detail. The twin booms reflected in the sunrise, the hum of both engines beating in rhythm, the quiet after landing when the world seemed too still. They remembered the smell of oil, the heat of the cockpit, the tremor in their hands after battle. They remembered what it meant to be part of something greater than themselves. A machine, a mission, a moment in history. Years later, when they told their stories, they did not speak of medals or scores. They spoke of distance, of precision, of the thin line between man and machine that the Lightning had taught them to walk. Because in the end, the P-38 Lightning was not just a fighter. It was a message, a warning whispered into the next century, that in the pursuit of mastery, humanity had found both its greatest strength and its quietest sorrow. When the war ended, silence fell across the Pacific, a silence deeper than any victory parade could fill. The waves rolled over the same waters where men had fought and died, and the sky once streaked with fire became clean again. The P-38 Lightning, the plane that had begun as a weapon of vengeance, now found itself without an enemy to chase. Some were parked on airfields, wings folded, engines cooling for the last time. Others were loaded onto ships, bound for scrapyards that melted down their aluminum bodies into new beginnings, bridges, cars, machines of peace. The world no longer needed them to hunt. It needed them to rest. Yet even in peace, the Lightning's legacy refused to fade. Engineers studied its design, its twin booms, its power balance, its aerodynamic symmetry. They saw in it the blueprint for the future, the understanding that stability and speed could coexist. The lessons learned from its frame would shape the jets of tomorrow. Lockheed's engineers, who had once drawn its curves in pencil and sweat, now turned their minds to the jet age. They built the P-80 shooting star, sleeker, faster, lighter, but its heart still carried echoes of the Lightning. The twin-engine mindset, the obsession with endurance, the precision of control, all born from the lessons of that warplane. In museums, the few surviving Lightnings stood beneath dim lights, polished to perfection. Silent and proud, children pressed their faces to the glass, marveling at its shape. To them it was just an old machine, but to the men who walked beside it, it was something sacred. It was memory forged in metal. It was proof that survival could be engineered. In the Pacific, fishermen sometimes pulled fragments of aluminum from the sea, twisted pieces of wing, corroded propellers, instruments marked Lockheed. They did not know the stories behind them, but they could feel their weight. Each relic was a whisper from the past, a reminder of the storm that once roared over their waters. For those who had flown it, the Lightning lived on in dreams. They would wake in the night, heart pounding, ears ringing with the phantom hum of twin engines. They would remember the vibration of the cockpit, the feel of the yoke, the sudden silence when the guns stopped firing. The war might have ended, but the rhythm of the Lightning never left them. One veteran, years later, stood before a restored P-38 and placed his hand on its cold metal. He said softly, "You brought me home." It was all he needed to say. The plane had been more than a machine. It was a bridge between eras, between instinct and technology, between myth and method. It had shown that survival in the modern age was not about bravery alone, but about learning faster than you could fall. It was, in every sense, the beginning of the future. Historians would later write that the Lightning was a machine ahead of its time. They were right. It was the first to teach that war in the sky was no longer about who could turn tighter or dive faster. It was about who could adapt, who could take the chaos of combat and shape it into calculation. Every bolt, every wire, Every inch of that twin fuselage design was a lesson in evolution, and that, perhaps, was the greatest truth the Lightning left behind. It was not just a weapon of war. It was a teacher, one that spoke in wind, fire, and silence. Decades later, when jets carved through the sky faster than sound, the old pilots would look up and smile faintly. They knew where it had all begun, in the hum of twin engines, in the silver reflection of sunlight on aluminum wings, in a time when the world was learning how to fight not for domination, but for survival. The P-38 Lightning had carried men through that storm. It had burned across the Pacific like a streak of vengeance and ended as a symbol of endurance. It had outlasted its war, outlived its creators, and entered legend not because it was perfect, but because it endured. And somewhere above the calm sea it once conquered, you can almost still hear it, faint, distant, steady. The twin heartbeat of the machine that taught humanity how to rise beyond its limits and to survive the sky itself. Years after the war ended, the world changed shape, nations rebuilt, cities rose from the ashes, and skies once filled with gunfire now carried only the sound of peace. But even in this quiet, the memory of the P-38 Lightning endured, not as a weapon, but as a symbol of transformation. In hangars across America, mechanics and veterans worked to restore the few remaining Lightnings. They sanded the wings, replaced the rivets, polished the aluminum until it shone like new. When the engines roared again, people gathered to listen, not to the sound of war, but to the echo of history breathing once more. It was a sound that seemed to carry the voices of all who had flown before. At air shows, the Lightning became a bridge between generations. Old men pointed upward, eyes wet with memory, telling their grandchildren about the Pacific, the clouds, the endless blue where they had once lived and nearly died. The children listened wide-eyed, hearing in their words the rhythm of courage, fear, and endurance. And for a moment, the old warbird was young again, in museums. Plaques told its story in clean lines and quiet tones. But those who knew its truth understood that the Lightning's story could never fit in words alone. It had to be heard. The rise of engines, the whistle of wind through its twin tails, the deep thrum that had once meant life or death. It was not a relic. It was a heartbeat captured in metal. Lockheed's engineers, who had once drawn its silhouette on blue paper under dim factory lights, moved on to design the future, the constellation, the U-2, the Blackbird. Each carried within it a fragment of the Lightning's spirit, balance, endurance, precision. The same philosophy, that beauty and purpose were one, echoed through every new generation of aircraft. But for the men who had flown her, no jet could replace the feel of those twin engines. No machine could replace the sound that began deep in the chest and ended in the soul. The Lightning had been their companion through terror and triumph. Through fire and silence, it had carried them across oceans, through storms, into history. In Japan, too, a quiet respect remained. Pilots who had once flown the Zero spoke of the Lightning with admiration. They had faced it in battle and survived, or had not. Either way, they remembered it not with hatred, but with reverence. They understood what it meant to face an opponent built not from rage, but from reason. The Lightning had turned the tide of war. But it had also marked the end of an era, the moment when the sky became an arena not of heroes, but of systems, of science, of evolution. It was both the end of one story and the beginning of another. When historians traced the lineage of flight, they saw it clearly. The P-38 stood between the fragile biplanes of the past and the jet-powered thunder of the future. It was the hinge upon which modern aviation turned, and yet, its greatest achievement was not in combat, nor in numbers. It was in what it represented, the union of imagination and discipline, courage and calculation. It was proof that the human mind, when tested by fear, could create something that transcended destruction itself. In the years that followed, one Lightning remained in the air longer than the rest. It flew in exhibitions, over parades, over fields that had once been battlefronts. Each time it rose into the sky, the crowd fell silent, and when it banked against the light, its twin tails glinting in the sun, it seemed for a moment that time had folded, that the war, the years, the loss had all become one long echo fading into peace. When it finally landed for the last time, its engines idled, then stopped. The air grew still. Mechanics climbed the ladder, turned off the switches and closed the canopy. The plane that had once outrun death now rested in stillness. A veteran standing nearby took off his hat and whispered, "She always came home, and that, more than anything, was her legacy. The Lightning was not built to conquer. It was built to return, and it always did. Even now, when the wind moves across the empty runways of forgotten bases, some say you can hear it, faint, distant, steady. The hum of twin engines fading into history. Not the sound of war, the sound of survival. The Pacific today is calm, its surface smooth, its islands green again, its skies unbroken by the scars of war. The world has changed, but somewhere beneath those waves lie the bones of machines that once carried the fate of nations. Among them rest the remnants of the P-38 Lightning, the silent witnesses of an age when men learned to fight not with rage, but with reason. Divers sometimes find them, resting on the ocean floor, their wings outstretched as if still flying through the deep. Their metal is worn, their markings faded, but their shape is unmistakable. Twin booms, twin hearts, frozen in time. The sea has claimed them, but not their story. It still rises from the depths like air from a diver's lungs. Whispering through history, on land, one Lightning sits in a museum hangar, polished to mirror brightness. Visitors walk beneath its wings, reading plaques, snapping photos, unaware of the silence it once broke. But every so often, a veteran stands before it, hands clasped behind his back, and simply looks. He does not read the plaque. He does not speak. He just listens. In that quiet, the sound returns, faint, distant, twin engines beating in rhythm. He can almost feel the vibration under his boots, the rush of wind, the horizon opening ahead. He remembers the missions, the fear, the cold breath of the stratosphere, and for a moment, the years fall away. He is young again. He is flying home. The Lightning story was never just about war. It was about evolution, of machines, of men, of understanding. It taught that power without control is chaos, and that precision, not passion, wins the sky. It proved that technology could reflect humanity, its creativity, its resilience, its contradictions. It was built for vengeance. It became a symbol of endurance, and in doing so, it captured something eternal, the will to adapt, to learn, to survive. The P-38 was not the fastest plane of the war, nor the most maneuverable, but it was the most balanced, between innovation and practicality, between ambition and necessity. It was the bridge between eras, the moment when flight became more than bravery. It became thought. The engineers at Lockheed had called it Lightning because of its speed, but its true name, earned through time, was something quieter, persistence. It struck once in war, but its echo lasted for generations. Every modern aircraft carries its ghost, in its design, in its discipline, in the understanding that perfection is not beauty, but purpose. The Lightning taught that lesson to every plane that followed, and so, as the sun sets over the Pacific, its reflection flickering on the calm waves, the spirit of the P-38 still lingers there, not as a shadow of war, but as a memory of progress. The sky it once conquered is now peaceful, and that is its final victory, because the greatest triumph of any weapon is to become unnecessary, and the Lightning achieved that. It began as a tool of destruction. It ended as a testament to survival, and in the silence of the world it helped to create, it still flies, unseen, eternal, carried on the wind that moves across the endless blue. The war is long over, but the story of the P-38 Lightning remains, not in the roar of its engines, but in the quiet lesson it left behind. That knowledge is stronger than pride, that endurance is the truest form of victory, and that even in the darkest storm, there will always be wings willing to rise again.